contrast of worship. And our text is 1 Kings is chapter 12, verse 25, all the way through chapter 16, verse 34. And that's also 2 Chronicles chapter 11, 11 chapters 1 through 16 to verse 14. Of course, now our focus today it's all over the place. First is 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 26 through 33. And then we go over to chapter 14 with verses 15 to 16. And then we finish up in chapter 15, verses 9 through 13. So it's a little all over the place. So we'll go and get as far as we can. From this point forward, 1st and 2nd Kings and 2nd Chronicles records the histories of the different kings of Judah and Israel. Most of these kings were evil, leading the people into idolatry. Of the 19 kings of Judah, very few did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. In our lesson today, King Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord. And also Jehoshaphat, Hezekiah, and Josiah, they also did what was right in the Lord. And then Israel had 19 kings, and none of them did what was right in God's eyes. So they was in sin for quite a while. Continued sinning for quite a while. When a person forsakes God to worship idols, it leads to all kinds of evil. Sexual immorality was a common sin of idolatry. Idolatry is a religion of Satan, which involves the worship of demons. In today's world, what we put before God becomes our idol. In other words, if we put something before what God wants, that's our idol, whatever it is. It's not one particular, it can be several different things. And now we'll start in 1 Kings chapter 12, and now start with verse 25. Then Jeroboam built Shechem in Mount Ephraim, and dwelt therein, and went out from hence, and built Peniel. Now, Shechem was where Rehoboam was crowned king and eventually became the first capital city of the northern kingdom. And the city of Peniel, which means the face of God, Jacob wrestled with God there. This at least existed since the days of Gideon, but he had the city destroyed because they wouldn't give him provisions while he was chasing the Midianites. And then Jeroboam may have rebuilt or fortified the city because it was already existing. In other words, he didn't build the city from the ground up. He just repaired and fortified it and made it better than what it was. In Judges chapter 8 and verse 8, and he went up thence to Peniel, and spake unto them likewise. And the men of Peniel answered him, as the men of Succoth had answered him. And in verse 17, and he beat down the towers of Peniel, and slew the men of the city. In other words, it's telling what Gideon did there. And then verse 26, Jeroboam said in his heart, now shall the kingdom return to the house of David? Jeroboam was fearing that the people's loyalty to him would be undermined. And he decides to establish alternate places of worship outside the Jerusalem. So he's saying, okay, I know what I'll do. I'll just make places of worship for here so they don't have to go clear to Jerusalem. Believing this will prevent them from returning to Rehoboam, the king of Judah. It highlights the danger of relying on human wisdom rather than trusting God's promises. We can get into a lot of trouble trusting in our own promises and not trusting in God. God had already chosen Jeroboam to lead the northern kingdom, but instead of trusting God's plan, Jeroboam began to fear losing control and looked for ways to secure his kingdom through human effort. In other words, God had already told him he was going to inherit the kingdom, but he didn't want to wait for God's time. He said, I'm going to do this now so I can take control right now. In verse 27, if this people go up to sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then shall the hearts of this people turn again unto their Lord, even unto Rehoboam king of Judah, and they shall kill me, and go again to Rehoboam king of Judah. Again here, Jeroboam is fearing the people's return to the house of David. He establishes golden calves in Bethel and Dan, declaring, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. That was his first one terrible mistake. He told them these idols is the ones that brought them up out of Egypt. And he's just digging himself a hole and getting in deeper. This act led the people worshiping idols and the division of the kingdom. In other words, this is what started the division of the kingdom. Jeroboam articulates his fear that continued worship in Jerusalem would lead to rebellion against his rule. Instead of trusting God's providence, he resorts to sinful measures, establishing golden calves and alternate objects of worship. Verse 28, whereupon the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold and said unto them, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Behold thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. These 2 golden calves that were made by Jeroboam were given the credit for bringing the Israelites out of Egypt. And that's where he's getting into deeper trouble there. These were gods of Satan. In other words, these were gods of Satan, these calves that were made. He was leading the people into the sin of idolatry. Exodus 32, chapter 32 and verse 4, he received them at their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool after he had made it a molten calf, and they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. He's trying to convince these people to stay where he is, to worship these idols, rather than going to Jerusalem. Now his reasoning, okay, we're going to start with verse 29. I'm getting ahead of myself here. And he set one in Bethel, and the other put he in Dan. His reasoning was for the convenience of the people. But his real reason was commercially based because it was good for his kingdom. That's one of the reasons he wanted to keep it there, because it was good for him. He didn't want anybody else to horn in on his stuff. Spiritually, it was the worst decision he could make spiritually. Yeah. And verse 30, and this thing became a sin, for the people went to worship before the one, even unto Dan. This term unto Dan suggests 2 things here. Dan is much farther away from Shechem, where Jeroboam resided, than Jerusalem. And number 2, placing an idol in a faraway city of Dan contradicted his reasoning. Dan had become an idolatrous city for a long time. So what his reasoning was, the one he put in Dan, it was a lot farther away than what it was to Shechem. So he contradicted what he was saying there. I'm just going to make it easy for the people so they don't have to go so far. Now verse 31, he made a house of high places, made priests of the lowest of the people, which were not the sons of Levi. These high places were temples that were used for unlawful worship. Jerusalem was a designated place for true worship at that time. These high places were used to worship pagan gods. They believed the higher the elevation for the altar would bring them closer to God. In other words, now a lot of times that's why they built them on top of mountains, the altar, because they felt like they'd be really closer to God that way, and God would be able to hear them. And the lowest of the people, they're not the sons of Levi. That was another mistake. The priests were supposed to be taken from the sons of Levi, and he's choosing his own priests. 2 Chronicles chapter 11, verse 14. For the Levites left their suburbs and their possessions and came to Judah and Jerusalem, for Jeroboam and his son had cast them off from executing the priest's office unto the Lord. Verse 15, and he ordained him priest for the high places and for the devils and for the calves which he had made. Verse 32, now Jeroboam ordained a feast in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, like unto the feast that is in Judah, and he offered upon the altar. So did he in Bethel, sacrificing unto the calves that he had made, and he placed in Bethel the priests of the high places which he had made. And this goes back to say, Jeroboam, he's fearing the people's return to Jerusalem for worship. He's establishing a rival religion center in Bethel and appoints priests to serve the golden calves he created, effectively creating a parallel religious system and leading the northern tribes into idolatry. So he's setting up his own religious platform there. This reminds us of our responsibility to lead people to Christ. The king sets up calves of gold, leads the people of God to worship these calves instead of God, and to worship in ways that God had not ordained or prescribed. In other words, that's what he's doing. Verse 33, so he offered upon the altar which he had made in Bethel the 15th day of the 8th month, even unto the month which he had devised of his own heart, and ordained a feast unto the children of Israel. He offered upon the altar and burnt incense. Jeroboam set up his own man-made religion, which opposed to a religion centered at the temple at Jerusalem. So what he did, it opposed what God had already set up for worship in Jerusalem. Any religion not established by God is a false religion. Just remember that. Any type of religion we set up other than God, it's a false religion. Numbers 15:39, and it shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that ye seek not after your own hearts and your own eyes, after which ye used to go a-whoring. In other words, don't listen to your own heart. God is what's important in, your eyes. Now in 1 Kings chapter 13, we don't have enough time to go through all of that, so I'm just going to highlight that whole chapter, and we're going to see. 1 Kings 13, it recounts a prophet from Judah's journey to Bethel, where he encountered King Jeroboam and an old prophet. The story emphasizes the importance of obedience to God's word and warns against following false prophets, highlighting the consequences of disobedience for both the prophet and the king. This story takes place during the region of Jeroboam, the king of the newly formed northern kingdom of Israel, who had established alternate places of worship, including altars at Bethel and Dan. A prophet from Judah sent by God travels to Bethel, where Jeroboam is offering sacrifices at the altar. The prophet prophesies that Jeroboam's altar will be destroyed, and that a descendant of David, Josiah, will come and burn the priests of the high places. Jeroboam's rejection and the prophet's disobedience. Jeroboam attempted to persuade the prophet to stay and eat with him, but the prophet refuses, as he is commanded by God not to eat or drink with him. Keep that in your mind. God's already commanded him, I don't want you to go back and drink and eat with him. I want you to go back a different way. Now here, the old prophet, who is also at Bethel, doesn't say who he is, it just says he's an old prophet, who is at Bethel, convinces the man of God to stay and eat with him, claiming that an angel sent by God had told him to do so. The prophet, despite his initial obedience, succumbs to the old prophet's deception and eats and drinks with him, disobeying God's command. As a consequence, he is killed by a lion on his way back to Judah for his disobedience, because he disobeyed what God said. God said, don't you go eat and drink with them. This older prophet convinced him that God had told him that you can go ahead and do this. So there's a lot of trouble there. The story serves as a cautionary tale, demonstrating that even those who have received God's favor, performed miracles, can fall into the sin and face severe consequences for disobedience. So nobody is prone to that. They're all susceptible. It don't matter how good you are, you can be led astray if you're not careful. In our lesson for today, this story teaches the importance of obedience, following God's commands even when they seem difficult or inconvenient. And then recognizing the false prophets and teaching and not being swayed by them. In other words, a discernment, knowing what is true and what is false. Humility, approaching God's word with humility and submission. In other words, with humble and always be willing to submit to God. Now, trusting in God, relying on God's guidance and protection rather than our own wisdom or desires. That's basically what chapter 13 is about. So, now we go into chapter 14, starting with verse 15. For the Lord shall smite Israel as a reed is shaken in the water, and he shall root up Israel out of the good land which he gave to their fathers, and shall scatter them beyond the river, because they had made their groves provoking the Lord to anger. This verse outlines the gravity of God's pronouncement, illustrating that the house of Jeroboam will be uprooted and scattered because of their sins, likened to a reed being shaken in the water. This imagery denotes fragility, instability, serving as a warning that only through true devotion can a kingdom stand firm. And then I have Deuteronomy chapter 12 and verse 3. And ye shall overthrow their altars and break their pillars and burn their groves with fire, and ye shall hew down the graven images of their gods and destroy the names of them out of the palace. And ye shall not do so unto the Lord your God. In other words, now in verse 16, and ye shall give Israel up because of their sins of Jeroboam, who did sin and who made Israel to sin. In the context of the divided kingdom of Israel, the consequences of Jeroboam's actions become acutely clear. He is warned of divine judgment against his region due to his idolatrous practices, which not only leads Israel away astray, but also jeopardizes his family's legacy. Now, we're going into chapter 15, starting with verse 9. And in the 20th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, reigned Asa over Judah. 1 Kings 15:9, the text states that Asa did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did his father David. This signifies that Asa, the king of Judah, followed the example of his father David in his religious practices, and that his actions were pleasing to God. In other words, Asa's main concern and determination was to do what God wanted, and that pleased God. That was pleasing to God. Verse 10, 41 years reigned he in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Abisalom. And then being a good king, had the blessings of a long reign, and reached and even exceeded the years of the region of David and Solomon. In other words, his kingship was longer than what David and Solomon's kingship was. So he served twice as long as what they did. Micaiah, she is called his mother, not because she brought him forth, but because she brought him up. And this is observed to his commendations, that though he was educated by an idolatrous woman, yet was not corrupted by her as his father was. In other words, being raised by an idolatrous woman, he stayed true to God. He didn't allow that to get in his way and sway him the other way. And then I've got 1 Kings 15:2 here. These years reigned he in Jerusalem. 3 years reigned he in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Abisalom, also called Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel, and also called Absalom. Asa, in verse 11, Asa did that which was right in the eyes of the Lord, as did David his father. Again, this signifies that Asa, the king of Judah, followed the example of his father David by upholding what was righteousness in the eyes of God. We see a significant moment in King Asa's reign characterized by his commitment to doing what is right in the sight of God. And in verse 12, and he took away the Sodomites out of the land and removed all of the idols that his father had made. Asa's commitment to following God's ways, mirroring the piety of his ancestors, King David. He was committed to doing what God wanted. In 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 24, and there were also Sodomites in the land, and they did according to all the abominations of the nations which the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. Now we go into verse 13. Also Micaiah was his mother, even her he removed from being queen, because she had made an idol in a grove. Asa destroyed her idol and burned it by the brook of Kidron. King Asa, after ascending to the throne, removed his grandmother Micaiah from her position as queen mother because she had made an abominable image or idol for the worship of Azeroth, and Asa destroyed the idol and burned it at the brook of Kidron. And also 2 Chronicles chapter 15 and verse 16 through verse 18. And also concerning Micaiah, the mother of Asa, the king, he removed her from being queen because she had made an idol in the grove, and Asa cut down her idol and stamped it and burned it at the brook of Kidron. But the high places were not taken away out of Israel. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was perfect all his days. He wasn't a perfect individual. His heart was complete. He did what he followed God anyway. Also, he brought up into the house of God the things that his father had dedicated and that he himself had dedicated, silver and gold and vessels. Now, that's all I have for today, but I'd like to read this to you. I believe it's important. It's in setting the application. Do you need that kind of encouragement right now? Do you need to be reminded that the Lord is with you? Is with you as you faithfully serve Him? Even though you may be struggling with the evils of this world or the persecution that you might be enduring, God's with you. God will reward you. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, for as much as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. King Jeroboam and King Asa are on the opposite ends of the spectrum of faithfulness. Jeroboam lived for himself, while Asa sought to live for the Lord. Jeroboam played politics while Asa sought to please the Lord. Jeroboam built idols, Asa destroyed them. Neither man was perfect, but King Asa was much better than Jeroboam. Taking a look at your own life, which of these kings are you more like? So, as we see, Jeroboam, there was one point there where he was going against this prophet, and he reached out his hand, and God withered and paralyzed his hand, and he couldn't move back. And he begged the prophet to pray, so the prophet prayed, and he got his arm back. But that didn't change him. After witnessing what God had done and healed his arm, he still kept going in his own direction. So it doesn't matter. You can see what God does in your life. You can see miracles. You see how he helped you. But that doesn't mean that you're going to turn and follow him. So let's keep that in mind. Does anyone else have comments? Jim?
The other day I got a phone call. You won a contest. You got a brand new Mercedes and $1 million coming to you. There's only one other question. You already spent $500. Well, I'll take you bring the car and the money, and I'll meet you at the bank. We'll cash that check, and I'll give you your $500. Oh, it didn't work that way. I said, goodbye.
Yeah, there's a lot of that out there. You really got to be careful.
There you go. Yeah, I thought, oh wow, I got $1 million, I can do a lot of things.